Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, I now call to order the third meeting of the 7th session of the Open Working Group on Sustainable Development Goals. This morning, in accordance with our program of work, we will continue our consideration of sustainable cities, human settlements, sustainable transport, with a panel discussion followed by an interactive exchange of views. Our first panelist is Mr. Aromar Revi. Mr. Revi is the director of the Indian Institute of Human Settlements, which seeks to address through research and innovation India's challenges of urbanization. He is also an alumnus of the IIT Delhi and the Law and Management Schools of the University of Delhi. He is a member of the Leadership Council of the Sustainable Development Solutions Network and co-chair of the Urban Thematic Group. And I now invite my first speaker, Mr. Aromar Revi, to address the Open Working Group. Mr. Revi, you have the floor.
Morning, Excellencies, delegates and colleagues. It's a pleasure being here. I had the pleasure yesterday of hearing what I thought was a very telling debate. You know, I have 30 years of experience working on practice, policy, and education in this sector. And what really struck me yesterday was three things. The first thing was the level of commitment towards transformative change. The second thing is the detail of discussion in terms of operationalization. And then, of course, the quality of the debate in trying to look at the Sustainable Development Goals. Because the challenge that we faced with here is quite substantial. It's not only dealing with the opportunities of 7 billion plus people, it's also trying to bring together countries that go from, let's say, $500 per capita to about 80,000. And to do that, especially when we're dealing with questions of urbanization, poverty, and sustainability and dealing with inequity is a very significant challenge. So bringing all of this together is not the easiest thing. And I was really struck by the quality of what we heard yesterday. The UN for many of us seems an abstract entity, but I think after yesterday's debate, I'm quite convinced that we are in pretty good hands. So what I will do today is to be both provocative and also somewhat propositional around the question of why the world needs an urban sustainable development goal. This comes from the work of a fairly large community of us, and I'm speaking on behalf of myself and my co-chair, Cynthia, who's, I think, in the room, and of course a whole range of other institutions. So I guess the first question, the operational question is urban transformation possible? Because if it's not, there's really no utility or opportunity for a goal around that question. So let's look at the evidence. You know, one of the most dramatic experiences that we've seen in the period of less than 20 or 25 years is this image of Shanghai in 1987 and Shanghai today. So urban transformation, and this is an extreme example of dramatic change. I'll just take you back between those two images that actually happened over a period of less than 25 years. In a generation, this kind of change is possible. The question, of course, is whether this kind of change is sustainable, both for the country in which it's situated and, of course, for the rest of the world. And I think that's a key thing that we're trying to deal with, especially if we're able to try and address questions of equity, the end of extreme poverty, and questions of sustainability. So, in some senses, what I will lay out today is why a standalone urban sustainable development goal is actually a 21st century idea, who in my contention is an idea whose time has come, and the evidence is, you know, in a campaign that we launched about 90 days ago. So to frame this, and this is the way the SDSN has framed this, around 10 goals to make it simple, clear, and operationalizable. The goals could broadly be divided into 3 or 4 categories. One is, of course, what I would call a 19th century goal, to end extreme poverty, including hunger. This is something that goes back to Marx and Engels and a whole range of questions in the 19th century. And then a whole range of other goals which are tied to the beginning and the creation of the United Nations, dealing with education, dealing with health, dealing with rural development and prosperity, agriculture, and of course, with 1948, the question of human rights, gender inclusion, etc. And then there are late 20th century goals that take us to Rio, ecosystem services, transforming governance for sustainable development, and then what I would call early 21st century goals, which are challenging and difficult to operationalize. The big challenge around climate change, which I work a fair degree, around the question of achieving development within planetary boundaries, and then finally, the one that is the newest and most significantly challenging in some ways, at least conceptually, operationally probably less so, and that is how does one empower inclusive, productive, and resilient cities? And what you'd see here, of course, is that I've highlighted in red 2 goals, which we from SDSN actually see as back-to-back, 2 sides of the same coin. You cannot have sustainable cities without having sustainable agriculture and raising and addressing the question of rural poverty and prosperity. They're back-to-back. Cities cannot survive without food, without water, without ecosystem services, and everything that in a sense, rural areas promote. And of course, cities are a very dramatic way to try and improve the quality of life, either by induced or direct effects. And it has probably, in many parts of the world, including in South Asia, one of the most important drivers of improvement in rural prosperity and reduction in poverty. So in a sense, we have to look at an urban sustainable development goal within the context of a larger development framework. It cannot be looked at as something that is seen in isolation. It's linked to a whole range of other processes. You cannot achieve urban sustainability without looking at questions of equity and justice. You cannot address it without looking at questions of education and healthcare, and you cannot make it possible without looking at questions of ecosystem services and biodiversity. About 90 days ago, at the UCLG summit in Rabat, which brought together, in a 100-year centenary celebration, pretty much, all the major cities of the world, 2,500 of them, we had a very interesting conversation. We said, look, we have 90 days to bring the message from the communities and the urban community, in a sense, to this meeting. What I'm happy to tell you is we've managed to pull together, under the leadership of Habitat, much of the urban community to actually support this goal. I'll quickly run you through a few slides on that. As of this morning, there are 170 cities and regional governments pulled together by UCLG, and you can see a large number of them, and that's a website where you can actually go out and check that out. There are over 40 leading academic and international institutions that are actually supporting this goal and making it happen. And to quote from Mayor Eduardo Perez, who's just taken over as chair of C40, he sent in a letter, I think, that arrived on Friday to the co-chairs of the OWG. What he says is, and this is important because these cities actually contribute a very significant part of global product, and they bring together a large number of people. What he says is, as a global mayor and one whose city is one that will be forever linked to the global sustainable development agenda, that's Rio plus 1020, I cannot stress enough the fact that without an urban goal, the SDGs will be incomplete. So what we are hearing is a wider urban community, of course with different lenses, all saying that this is something that's quite important. So now we have over 200 entities that are supporting this process. The evidence is here. You can go and check out the website. So why does the world need an urban SDG? As an academic, let me give you a little bit of perspective. About 100 years ago, the world, and this is just the large cities in the world, had a population of 1.5 billion people, a gross world product of about 2 trillion, which the urban share was 30%. And you can see the large cities, and I'm only going to show you the large cities from UNPOP, about 750,000, were only in some parts of the world. Then I jump 50 years ahead, 1950, world population 2.5 billion, the urban share 29%, gross world product up from 2 trillion to 7 trillion, but the urban share rising dramatically after the Second World War to 45%. Jump again to where we are today. Global population 7 billion, urban share slightly more than 50%, gross world product 70 trillion, urban share 70%. That's $50 trillion. And then if you look sometime in the future, urban population 2025, 8 billion, urban share 58%, potential depending on how growth actually happens, of world product 85 trillion, urban share about 75%. So let me just whip you through these slides again. This is the urban transformation that we have seen over a process of less than 110 years. And it is this transformation that has given us the opportunity to end the most important scourge of development in this century, and that is to end absolute poverty. It is the productivity of cities and the opportunities that they present, apart from all the other challenges we heard yesterday, that makes this actually possible. But there are new emergent challenges. Cities create a lot of externalities. That's the impact in terms of climate change. What I'd like to say here is urbanization is not just another mega trend. It's actually a gigatrend. It's a millennium transformation of human culture, and culture is very important to understand here, society, economy, polity, and unfortunately, and this is a big challenge for us as far as sustainability is concerned, unfortunately, impact at the planetary scale. So this is something that actually happens over a period of 1,000 years. I mean, we're seeing of tremendous trends. So the question then is, did the MDGs do justice to this question? I guess very quickly, there was no real urban MDG, but some progress was made. The slum MDG has been achieved, but we still have 1 billion people in slums, another billion if we don't do much about it. And then there are a whole range of questions that are there. You know, the MDGs were focused on poor people in poor countries. We have to build a framework now that embraces everybody. We have to engage with the question of local and regional governments, otherwise the operationalization of this process will not work. We have to bring in economic development and employment together, especially after 2008. We have to deal with questions of sustainability and resilience. And of course, very critically, as far as cities are concerned, we have to deal with questions of social inclusion. And it's not only Latin America and other parts of the world that are concerned about this, there are other parts of the world that are important. So the world, in some senses, does need an SDG which can enable us to take these processes forward, mainstream some of these questions, and promote linkages. So what are the challenges? I guess the core challenge, and this builds on work starting with Brundtland, is it's not only a question of intergenerational equity, it's also an intergenerational question. And cities provide you the opportunity of bringing this together. And of course, we talk about a new global architecture in terms of governance. There's also a question of linking a local architecture, which actually builds at the multi-level between state parties, local and regional government firms, and of course the rights and opportunities of communities and citizens. Yesterday we heard a number of counterfactuals, and I wouldn't be a good academic if I didn't actually address those questions. The first counterfactual, of course, is what one would call the rural-urban dichotomy. Like I showed you a little bit earlier, it is not possible for cities to be sustainable unless areas around them in which they're embedded, regions around them in which they're embedded are sustainable. So it's a regional question. I think we are doing a disservice to ourselves and to our population, both in cities and rural areas, by setting up a dichotomy which doesn't actually work. Then, of course, the question of, if you have an urban goal, then you'll have a rural goal. In actual fact, they're complementary, because unless the ecosystem services and the agriculture is assured, there's no way that these massive reproductive systems can work. There was also a debate yesterday about whether infrastructure is a better way to frame this than looking at an urban goal. What I would say to that, of course, and you represent 7 billion plus people, the fundamental challenge today is about people and institutions. Infrastructure, of course, is very, very important. It underlies the process of development and transformation. But if we forget people, and that's where the fundamental challenge and opportunity of cities lie, I think we would be missing the point of culture, of economic development, and of human development. So infrastructure is important, but I think it's something that sort of we would try and embrace in other ways. And then, of course, you need to mainstream urban and rural into a whole range of other goals. We've had a very interesting set of discussion around education and healthcare on that question. The big opportunity here, of course, is of localizing, especially in questions of education, healthcare, and a whole range of other processes to enable the operationalization of process. The real question, of course, and I will be somewhat impolitic here, the real question is not the evidence of whether local and regional governments can actually deliver this. The real question is of political and fiscal devolution. And this, of course, is something that you, as the representatives of countries across the world, have to address. Because unless we address this question in an operational way, I think it would be rather difficult to try and enable the goals to work themselves out. So the question I have here, it's a sharp question, is why should we use 19th century ideas, which are siloed into a number of sectors, very good with dealing with a world of 1 or 2 billion people, but when you're dealing with megacities of 10 or 15 million, mega-urban regions of 40 or 50 million, we have to reimagine how governance needs to be organized. And I think the nation states that are here have to be able to engage with this question to address this new 21st century challenge. So it's not a trivial challenge, both intellectually, operationally, and within the frame of law and governance that we. So how would we articulate one way of looking at this? And this is in a sense, is a worked example. I'm going to try and show you how one sort of lens can look at this question, because there were questions yesterday as operationalizing it. This is the SDSN's way of looking at it, and there are other ways, but I would say, by and large, aligned in the broad direction. So what would a goal look like? This is the way that we put it. Make all cities socially inclusive. I think this is very important as the first question. Economically productive, environmentally sustainable, secure. That's a real question in many parts of the world, and resilient to climate change and other risks. We're having this discussion over this week to try and look at climate, disaster risk, transportation, and a whole range of other challenges. And to make this happen, develop participatory, accountable, and effective city and metropolitan governance to support rapid and equitable urban transformation. The rapid is important because of the way the world is actually going, because of the aspirations of a whole range of young people, and of course, transformation is critical. But it has to be sustainable. There are a range of targets, and I will try and go through a worked example here. This is really work in progress. I'm, as an academic, a little bit reticent to actually show it to you, but I thought, since the discussion was so honest and candid yesterday, we'll try and take a shot of that. What we did is, literally over yesterday and today, we've taken a case of 2 cities based on some criteria for success. Bangalore, the city that I live and work in for much of the year, and surprise, surprise, New York, thanks to the work of some of my colleagues, including Cynthia and Bill Solecki from... So, this is how Target A may look like. Again, this is a straw person. You need to debate and rebuild this in the way it needs to be operationalized. So, we need to end extreme urban poverty. Otherwise, we cannot achieve the end of poverty. We need to expand employment and productivity. We need to raise living standards, especially in slums and informal settlements. I can tell you that from 25 years of experience in trying to do this in South Asia and other parts of the world. So how would this look? Let me show it to you for a city like Bangalore. We took the targets, then we took some very arbitrary, but I think rational indicators here, and then we tried to look at how this would play itself out as we move from the MDGs. That's what the MDG line would look like at the baseline of 1990. That's how it looks like in 2000. That's what it might look like in 2015. And that's what it might look like if we go as per business as usual. And this is where the SDG may lie. This is a multidimensional index. This is fairly well known in the UN system. And what are the elements of this? Again, as I said, this is indicative. This is something that needs to be worked out. There's going to be a long debate and process of doing this. The first thing, of course, population with income above the national poverty line. Bangalore is actually quite a rich city. Fine. We actually have very few people living in slums, and you can see that as I move around the clock. The workforce participation rate is relatively low. We have a high dependent population that's there. And if you look at the black line there, female workforce participation, which is a very important indicator in terms of gender access and equity, is actually pretty low. And one of the key things would be to try and move it up over the next 15 or 20 years. The gender wage disparity is high. And of course, because of the way that inclusion works on financial services, a large number of households don't actually have access to banks, which means a whole range of things are not possible. Again, as I said, this is an indicative set. But what I'm trying to show you is it's possible to try and operationalize that. And so, in a great leap of faith, my colleagues from New York try to do something very similar. And let's see how New York is doing. That's 1990. Not doing so well in terms of female workforce participation or gender wage disparity. That's 2000, that's 2015. That may be business as usual if all the political changes that are happening in the city actually happen. And that might be where the SDG would take you. And then, in some senses, even though the details of the indicators may be different, we made a lot of assumptions here. I'm really going out on a limb showing you this. The point is, it's possible to actually compare. Now, these are not strictly comparable. We have a $1 trillion city at one end, and whatever it is, a few $1 billion city at the other end, with lots of poor people in some senses. Similarly, target B, ensure universal access to well-designed, secure, and affordable built environment. Basic services, we heard this echoed again and again in this room yesterday, including housing, water, sanitation, waste management, low-carbon energy and transportation systems. I think we'll hear more about this through the day. And of course, something that would surprise people, because this is transformative, mobile and broadband communication. So similar process here. You can look at the indicators, you can run them through, and you see interesting opportunities here. What we will see in Bangalore, for example, is almost 100% penetration of broadband systems. There's New York for you. And there's a comparison. Let me quickly take you to the third one, which looks at environmental questions. Target C, ensure safe air and water quality for all, to integrate reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, efficient land and resource use, very critical. If the land markets don't function along with the labor markets, if transportation doesn't pull it together, and we can't address climate and disaster resilience, operationalizing this would be difficult. Here we find very significant challenges, both in Bangalore and, interestingly, in spite of Sandy, in New York. You find a whole range of sectors in which there's a lot to be done and a lot can be put together. So very quickly at the end, what I've tried to show you is that an urban SDG is and that's very important, I think, in the process of transformation, is inspirational. It gives people the hope and the possibility of change actually happening in their lifetimes, not only in some places, like I showed you Shanghai in the beginning, and I could have shown you other cities, but in many places across the world, especially in the small and medium towns where the dramatic changes will take place. It is aspirational. People can aspire to it, and it can actually change a whole range of things. And more important, it is something that can be operationalizable. So what I showed you was, in a sense, a thought experiment of how you might want to do this, and this is something that needs to be operationalized and engaged with UN systems, national governments, etc. It can bring together, like I showed you again in the multidimensional index, multiple sectors, a whole range of actors and processes in new ways that, and this is important, that can help us focus on the synergy between opportunities. When we look at cities, we often look at the problems that we have. We look at the problems of poverty, we look at the problems of social exclusion, which is serious in many parts of the world. We look at the problems of actually being able to operationalize this within the government frames. But I think if we're able to reimagine how things can be done, the synergy between opportunities will help us overcome the many current systemic and structural challenges that we have. And let's not kid ourselves about it. There are serious systemic and structural challenges. This will not be easy. This will require reimagined institutional and financial architecture at multiple levels: community, city, region, nation state, globally. It will require new processes and metrics. But, and this is something that has to be proved, it should be, and this comes from experience, from the community that I'm speaking for, it should be more equitable, politically and economically viable, cheaper, because if you do it quicker, it's much better in an expanding world, and more efficient than an unstructured, unplanned, business as usual that we're seeing happening across the world. 60% of what needs to be done, especially in the global south, is yet to be built. So the opportunity is dramatic. And finally, the commitment of member states, regional and local governments, communities and enterprises, and of course the knowledge sector, which is very, very important, to transformative governance, is what could make this possible. So I commend this opportunity to you, and I hope as we go forward over the next few months, we will see this as something that we can take and actually help transform the lives not only of 3.5 billion people in urban areas, but of all of us, our governments, our communities, and our enterprises. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Revi. That was very insightful. And you packed a lot of information in very little time. Thank you very much. The floor is now open for interactive dialogue. I now recognize Venezuela. Venezuela, you have the floor.
Muchísimas gracias.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'm very grateful for today's presentations, because they show a great deal of wisdom and respect, given what we've heard. In particular, I would like to insist on the affirmation that was made that there is not a sustainable city without sustainable agriculture, because we have to break this dichotomy between the city and the country. There cannot be sustainable urbanization if the field continues to be seen in negative, pejorative terms. And so that this relationship between agriculture and the development of the city is extremely important. I've also heard a great deal said about development in general, and we're not speaking about development in general. We're holding a meeting on sustainable development. And yesterday, a great deal of emphasis was placed on the fact that the organization is focusing on development. and development in general. But this is not a meeting on development in general. And so I'm very thankful for today's comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your comments. I now recognize India. India, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Co-Chair. And this has indeed been a very, very rich discussion this morning. And I wanted to raise a particular point, and I thought I'll ask the presenters for their views. A lot of discussion over yesterday and today has happened over the fact of the new urbanization. I mean, many speakers have alluded to the fact that how a lot of urbanization is going to take place from now till 2050, and what implications that has for our overall sustainable development. Now, that is a very valuable point and a very important point, because we have to talk about the new cities evolving. But the one fact which perhaps we should also address, or at least recognize, is that practically barring the regions of Asia and Africa, the world is already more than 3/4 urban. In fact, in the developed world, the proportion of urbanization is already 80%. So you have the new urbanization, and you also have the old urban centers. And in many ways, the challenges facing these two sets of urban centers could conceptually be seen as slightly different. From the point of view of since new is slightly simplistic, from the point of view of urban centers in the developing countries, I would presume that the overall challenge would be infrastructure creation, provision of basic services, slum reduction, sanitation, clearly targets which we would certainly support in case we are looking at urbanization as a standalone area. Whereas for the older urban centers, I would presume that the challenges would be more towards retrofitting of infrastructure, efficiency issues, preventing over-dependence on private transport, which is turning out to be, as Professor Fulton was pointing out, very difficult to change, issues of carbon footprints, etc. So how do we, my question for the panelists is, how do we look at this issue and craft an approach which is inclusive, which can add value both to the new urban centers as well as the old and the developed urban centers, so that both of these sets of players can play their role in sustainable development. Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair.
Thank you, India. I now recognize Benin Minister. Attendez, s'il vous plaît. Can we have the mic for the Minister of Benin? Voilà.
D'accord. Monsieur le Président.
Chairman, thank you very much. I very much endorse many of the issues that have been raised here, but I think there's one thing that's absolutely vital that was raised that we need to really study in depth. The fact that there is no development, there is no sustainable, viable city without development of the rural world. And I think in that respect, we must understand that the problems we have in the cities are linked to the fact that those who are in the villages also hope for a better life, which leads to a rural exodus. So the whole strategy of sustainable development should seek to keep that population, they should be offered about the same standard of living that people have in the countryside. So to do this, we think that the development of infrastructure seems vital in this regard in the rural world. And we speak of infrastructure, we speak above all of hydro-agricultural infrastructure that can allow those populations to have 2 or 3 or 4 harvests rather than just depending on rain. So we're speaking here about energy to allow and to protect vegetation. We're also talking about everything to do with everything that could allow access to inputs. For example, land reform that would allow people to have access to land. So everything that could allow those populations to let them have what we could call the Millennium Village. so they can have access to the same services that they could have in the cities. So that's an element that would be decisive in creating a viable city. Now, on the other hand, we also spoke of innovation, particularly when it comes to transport. But it would be interesting to look at the cost of that innovation. Now, those innovations, are they accessible? Are they affordable for very low-income countries? What are they to do? And I also think that another element is we emphasized reducing mortality by reducing poverty and reducing pollution. I agree with that. But that also means that we need to harmonize our energy policies, particularly when it comes to carbon subsidies, because I see that there's a problem taking place between the US and Venezuela. You have the same problem though in Africa. In other words, people are buying fuel in places where it costs less, so they can resell it in other places. You could call it contraband of fuel, or stockpiling and redistribution of those fuel. And this fuel constitutes an element of pollution. And even when it's placed in cars and vehicles, the pollution rate is obviously higher. So that also is something we need to address in our fiscal policies when it comes to fuels. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Minister. Japan, you have the floor.
Thank you, Co-Chair, and good morning to everyone. I would like to extend my sincere thanks for both presenters for the very rich and excellent presentations. And I have one question for Dr. Revi and another question for Dr. Fulton. Firstly, Dr. Revi, I just want to, taking this opportunity, I just want to thank for your attendance at yesterday's side event. And yesterday, we listened to the executive director of the Habitat, Dr. Cross, and he emphasized the three fundamental aspects: the rules and the regulations, design, and the financial plan, if I'm not mistaken. So it seems to me that your approach is a bit different from the Dr. Cross. Your approach is focusing on the inclusiveness, sustainability, economic productivity, resilience, and security, if I'm not mistaken. So how do you find the approach by the Dr. Cross of the Habitat, and can you reconcile your ideas with the approach by the Dr. Cross? So that is a question from Dr. Revi.
I'm going to ask the speakers to respond. We have 4 other member states that will come back. I'll come back to you shortly.
I'll pick up sort of 3 clusters of responses. The first one is the rural-urban question, which I think is a very central question. Again, to reiterate there, the balance is important. But apart from the balance, the fundamental thing I think which we're all agreed on is that we have to end extreme poverty. And that means building the linkages between urban and rural areas, whether it's in terms of remittances, in terms of job opportunities, and like we've heard just now, being able to provide basic services and a quality of life which is equivalent in rural areas as in urban areas. The question is, do we do it in a 21st century way of doing it, or do we do it in a 19th and 20th century? And I'll sort of spend a short while here trying to explain what the opportunities are. The 21st century is about decentralized networked infrastructures. So whether you're talking about water management, or we're talking about renewable energy, we're talking about decentralized systems which are very different from the centralized fossil fuel-driven systems of the 20th century. So the opportunity in some senses, whether you're talking about wind or solar, geothermal, etc., on the energy front, is to set up these smart networks, especially those that have not built, that link together regionally. And I think this is the transformative opportunity that we have. And this is where a mix of good governance and technology can make a dramatic difference to both rural and urban areas. And let me take a concrete example here from an environment that I know pretty well. India at the moment has 8,000 urban centers, but but it has 640,000 villages. Fine? An 2 orders of magnitude difference. The question for us is, in terms of sustainability, in 2050, what will the ratio be like? Our estimates are that we might not have more than 20,000 urban centers, but the number of rural centers, as we peak out in our population, will probably will be in the order of the 200,000 or 300,000 regions. So you're talking about a system which has decentralized production and consumption and linked together in regional networks. And this is a very interesting question because it relates to the structure of economic production and consumption and where employment will be provided. And I think the core question that we have to address in a world in which fossil fuels are going to be increasingly rare and nutrients are going to be seriously challenged from the agriculture point of view is how many people do we require or can we provide safe, adequate livelihoods to be able to provide us the food and the ecosystem services to make this larger regional and global urban system work for us. So are we going to go the route of North America, Europe, and maybe Latin America and possibly China, where 5 or 10% of the population actually sort of provides these opportunities and services, or are we going to go to a more balanced system where maybe 20 or 30% of the population lives in a more decentralized way? The technologies of the 21st century give us the opportunity to do this. The question is whether the financing systems and the administrative and governance systems will allow us to do that. So that's sort of one quick response as far as that's concerned. The balance is important, and we have to keep that going. The second one, of course, is the differentiation between countries at different levels of urbanization and different levels of economic development. Obviously, especially in East Asia, South Asia, and increasingly in Sub-Saharan Africa, there's going to be there's an ongoing massive wave of building new small towns and larger metropolitan centers. So the bulk of the opportunity lies in the future. Maybe 50% or 60% of the new buildings, the new infrastructure is yet to be built. So if we are smart about it, if we are equitous about it, we can actually make a dramatic difference and not make the mistakes, within quotes, that we have actually seen many of the other parts of the world do, and have to sort of retrofit that. And even in a city like New York, which is a great city in many ways, you're working with a 19th century infrastructure, and it takes a lot of investment to be able to try and rebuild that. So obviously, there have to be different ways of doing things. There's a different sequencing of operations, and where you actually take your resources from, how do you finance the process of urban development is going to be different in different contexts. Some economies are much more market-oriented. Others have other ways of actually managing land markets and labor markets. I think we have to find different ways of doing this. And this is going to bring us to a very interesting challenge when we address the question of both urban and rural areas. And that is, there are some targets and indicators that must be and should be universal. There are others that may actually have to be locally specific. And this is an interesting question because we work with a system at the moment in many parts of the world where you're looking at universal indicators that work at national level, international level to provide compatibility. But in actual practice, if you want to operationalize changes, I'll give you an example. You can't manage, you can't compare, let's say, air pollution in Chicago and New York or even London or let's say, or New Delhi and average it. It is something that's very local. So you do have to have a mix of universal indicators and things that are localizable. The question for us, both on the governance side and technically, is how do you manage the balance between them? The third thing, of course, is the questions that there were two questions. One, of course, was an ICT. I think, from my experience, ICT provides a tremendous opportunity to actually reduce transaction costs, to be able to empower a whole range of people, including some of the most challenged populations, the most excluded populations, because they're able to connect with processes. The opportunities provided by smart grids, energy, water, and a whole range of things are essentially backed up by the availability of ICT processes in both urban and in rural areas. And of course, the structure of cities will change depending on how information flows take place. And as the nature of work and the nature of the difference between work and locations of residence change. Which brings me to, of course, the last question, and that was, is there any contradiction from what we heard from Dr. John Kloss yesterday and what I was saying? And I would say there isn't any contradiction at all, because what Dr. Klaus was dealing with was the core instruments of trying to operationalize this. For land and labor markets to work, you have to have effective planning and design. Now, the option, of course, is not to do it. And we know from across the world, whether it's in the OECD countries or otherwise, the cost of not doing this preemptively, whether it's in the legal and the regulatory regime or in terms of actually laying out the infrastructure, is much higher than doing a retrofit much, much later. So there's no question that urban design and planning is necessary and useful, but it has to be locally situated, whether it's in large sort of federal countries or in other places. And, you know, and related to that, of course, is the question of financing. Your structure of markets and governance may be very different from one country to the other, or even from one region to the other. So one has to have a flexible system which can accommodate this kind of process. And I think that is the intellectual challenge that we're dealing with here. And that is why this process is so important. And I think it's going to take us forward in that. Thank you very much.
Yes, let's continue with hearing from member states. I recognize the United States. United States, you have the floor.
Dr. Revi, if you could speak a bit more about the legal and regulatory regimes you were talking about. Dr. Fulton also mentioned the policy packages. I think we're all aware that there will be quite a lot of changes needed from municipalities and governments in order to implement some of these far-reaching changes. And I wonder if you could speak a little bit more in detail about those changes that would be required for countries at very different levels of development. Thank you.
And I recognize Brazil. Brazil, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Dr. Revi, regarding your matrix of goals and targets for sustainable cities, it was very illustrative. Thank you for the comparison, especially interesting. I was wondering, how would you see targets related that can put at the core of a city SDG that incorporates sustainable consumption and production and aims at tackling unsustainable patterns of consumption and production, which pose a great deal of a great challenge for our SDG agenda, and are especially concentrated in large cities. So I was wondering how you see that. Thank you.
Thank you, Brazil. France, you have the floor.
Merci, Monsieur le Co-Président.
Thank you, distinguished co-chairman. I'd sincerely like to thank the two panelists for their extremely convincing and suggestive and interesting presentations. I have two questions to put to Mr. Revi, and they will perhaps add to some of the questions that have already been raised. My first question to Mr. Revi is that I was quite interested in your compelling proposal to have the sustainable development outlook focused on the city, but then the question arises immediately, why at that level? Shouldn't we be looking at a broader level? Should we be looking at the entire territory, which would include then the city and the outer line areas? Or on the contrary, perhaps we should have a palette, if you will, of indicators or of targets that would include the city, but would also be of interest from different vantage points. So my basic question is, what is the added value of choosing sustainable development focused on the city? What will that bring to our discussions? And I hope that you won't simply respond by saying we do this because it's a priority, because after all, everything's a priority. Then my second question, still for Mr. Revi, has to do with the political, fiscal developments, the transfer of power. He said that this was an important goal. And I'd like to know how that can be reflected in concrete terms, in indicators or in targets, when the institutional situation in our different countries are quite varied. The transfer of power issue of fiscal and policy development are not the same in the United States, in China, in Burkina Faso. So how can you ensure that this will be an objective, an indicator, or a target which can be followed in a cross-cutting fashion? That's the question I wanted to ask you.
I have asked the Executive Director of UN Habitat to respond to one or two things that I think are directly related to some of the issues. This won't be the only time you can speak, so you don't have to make it long. Just a quick response, and then I'll come back to the panelists. And then we have 4 more speakers that I have on my list, and then we'll keep going until we finish the speakers list. Dr. Klaus.
Thank you very much. I appreciate very much the opportunity that you give me to contribute also today, and I will appreciate also very much the contribution of the 2 panelists today. I just wanted to answer to a distinguished delegate that has put this question about an urbanization goal can be of much interest for the developing problems of urbanization, but what we do with the developed city. And I think that this is very important because in that sense, this opportunity of having a urban or a goal, it addresses both sides. I think that we have a set of challenges in the developing world, which is the challenges that we have been talking during those days, yesterday and today. But also in the developed world, we need to change our cities. We need to retrofit our cities. And this is why also something that should be, if it's the case, in the targets, because we know that we cannot go on with the level of greenhouse emissions that we have in the developed cities. And in that sense, I think that the existence of urban goal has the advantage to address a universal approach, although with different measures and different attitudes. I totally agree with Mr. Revi that there's not any contradiction between what I focused yesterday on the issues of the legal measures, the planning and design measures, and the financial measures. Those are necessary instruments to get a good result. From a multilateral institution like the UN, we cannot, enter in the national politics, and we cannot say how do you need to organize these things in that way in order to give to reach this objective. If you want to have a distributive policy and you want to diminish poverty to the distribution system, this is usually that is decided at central government. Good or bad urbanization is not at the end the result. It's not what it will provide a distribution or not distributive system. In that sense, we are talking more in a physical manner, in a specific manner, which we see is lacking with our experience in most of the part of the developing world when they are trying to introduce urbanization. Usually they have norms, but they don't have capacity to apply them. And then the implementation capacity is fundamental. And then in that sense, we advocate for less norms, more clear norms, more understandable norms, but implementable. Also, there's usually no design, and there's usually no financial plan that it's designed originally in order to get. Of course, in order to get access of transport for all, or integrated city, or what very good outcome that we dream of, we need at least a functional city. It's not enough with a functional city. Apart from a functional city, probably you need a national policy, you need many policies, health policy, education policy. But the question is, the scenario where the thing is happening, which is the city, in itself, it is not neutral. It has rules, it has, patterns, it should be governed. This is the idea that we are trying to put in the table. Urbanization, it doesn't fall for the sky. It's an outcome of a specific set of actions, consensus, political decisions, etc., which at the end produces good urbanization. Good urbanization also, if you have an authoritarian government which doesn't defend human rights, is not going to provide human rights. Okay? Then we need to, in that sense, to be cautious, not to pretend, and please don't take for my words, that with good urbanization we are going to solve the problems of the world. No, no, no. Just good urbanization is one part of the good policies that can help and guide us to sustainable development. And finally, I want to perhaps insist a little bit more in this issue of urbanization versus rural, because I think that it's perhaps yesterday, in order to be provocative, I was very, in that sense, very strong. When my point is that urban area and rural area, they are in a continuous. We have small towns, market towns, intermediate towns, cities, megalopolis, etc. And the questions, the issues of urbanization, about the regulation of the urbanization, the design, the financial planning, they emerge at every level of these human settlements. All human settlements share these principles that I was talking yesterday, even if they are rural. And in fact, they serve best the rural population if they work well. Because what the rural population also requires for development, apart from agrarian policies, etc., it's good small towns which can provide markets, can provide distribution, can provide services, etc., etc. Then this is the sense that there is no contradiction between rural and urban development. And of course, both rural development and urban development that I advocate, it's a sustainable development. And this is why we insist so much that the developed cities, they need to retrofit their existing fabric because they emit too much greenhouse gases. And also this is why the 3 billion people that is going to be organized in the next coming years, they need to do in such a manner that they avoid the big mistakes or the errors that we have committed in our own urbanization process. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Klaus. Mr. Revi, do you want to go first? Some punchy responses so we give time for other comments.
First, a response on legal and regulatory systems. I'll be fairly frank here. There's a high diversity in land-based systems and land management systems across the world. So there cannot be any universal system that we can sort of advocate here. But to deal with the kind of questions that are important, if we have to deal with the questions of slum and informality, the question of tenure is a very critical one. Whether one is, how one does that with titling or a whole range of other purposes is something that both city and national governments have to address. On questions of risk, and we had some discussion about climate change here. Since I work a fair amount on both climate mitigation and adaptation, some areas in cities are exceedingly risk-prone, and we know that. Especially as the sea level rise is going to expand, and we have an increasing littoralization of the world population along sea coast, we're at considerable risk, especially poor people. So you have to be able to zone and organize cities so that you're not losing lives, you're not losing property, and you're not putting economic activity at risk. And then, of course, there are larger questions of density and economic structure. We have followed a form of development in many parts of the world where we've separated places of work and places of staying. In many parts of the world, in pre-colonial cities, we had mixed land use and things were tied together. We're now moving to a regime where I would imagine densities are not a bad thing to do, but of course, They are optimal densities that, if you go beyond a certain level of density, you have challenges in terms of externalities. If you go below that, you're not able to actually deal with the opportunities that cities provide in terms of, economies of scale and scope. So what I'm saying is, these questions of how your tenure systems are organized, how your land use and land categorization is organized, how your spatial structure is organized, and how your building codes and other processes need to be organized, are some things that very often would not only be different across different countries, but also in different cities within the same country, because the contexts are actually quite different. So I think, we're looking at trying to harmonize some basic principles with enabling the capacity at local level to take decisions and operationalize that effectively. And that's a challenge, because legal systems tend to sort of be universal in their functioning, but you may need to apply them in different contexts. And so that's the first response. The second response is to the question of cities and metropolitan areas and regions. I'd put up a star there. I ran through that slide very quickly. Obviously, cities are not what you would call, just sort of an urban boundary. We're talking, as Dr. John Claus just said here, about a continuum starting from small places all the way up to mega cities. The question, of course, is how you actually bound those systems. And that will be different in different parts of the world, because it relates very often to both governance systems and how fiscal and sort of land use are organized. So absolutely, we have to take a regional approach to these processes. We have to look at metropolitan regions, and that's true of certain parts of the world. In other parts of the world, you have the peri-urban fringe, which is a very important opportunity and challenge to deal with, and of course, sustainable sort of rural areas which are contiguous with urban. So this is a different way of looking at things. You cannot have cookie cutout kind of solutions for this. It means that we have to build local capacity with local and regional governments to respond to this effectively. We cannot do this centrally and sort of organize things in a particular way. So the idea of a palette is very important. Like I said, the difficult question is a question of fiscal and political power. And I think this is something, I guess, as an academic, I could say, is something that's actually going to be contested over the next 20 or 30 years. Because as cities become more and more organized, as citizens become much more active, there will be contests on where subsidiarity is actually going to organize itself. And of course, it'll be different because we have such a diverse range of political systems and systems of management in the room. And this is sort of an evolving question. But eventually, if you have to manage such large and complex and interdependent systems, you do have to transfer both the authority and the ability to respond to the local level, because that's how innovation will actually function, at least in my experience, and that is how change can be institutionalized. The operationalization of process really happens at the local level, and if you build it from the local level, it'll cascade upwards, and then you might have an outcome which we would be all very happy with. The question of sustainable production and consumption is a very interesting one, and it's challenging. It's challenging because it is a metabolism of our cities that is creating a serious challenge, not only in environmental terms, but also in terms of access. The problem is both a technical one and also, I would say, a question of governance. So there are some flows in the city that we have a much better handle on. So let's say if we take water, in many cities in the world, we have a much better understanding of how water flows. Then let's say, for example, how access to food actually functions, or let's say how critical things like carbon weigh itself out. So this is not an easy question to deal with. The metrics that are currently used are debated both in the science and the policy community. And I think one of the ways to look at this practically in the next couple of years is we should take a number of cities or some countries who are sort of more innovative and more willing to experiment than others and try and see how we can operationalize this at city level. And I think, this is what we've been trying to do within the urban community. I know ICLE has taken a lead on this, STSN, Communitas are trying to see how we can take this framework that I sort of set up as a thought experiment and see how it works at city level. The challenge, of course, is going to be very interesting. And that is, we're used to a global framework which then applies to national governments and, of course, devolves later. What you may find in this process, when we start looking at questions of sustainable production and consumption, is that processes that start at city level may actually force us to reconfigure how we look at indicators and targets at national level and otherwise. So this is an interesting dialectic, and I think we need to set up a process to test this. We don't know the answers to this question, but I think this is an interesting question to try and deal with. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll take probably the last series of questions now and comments. If we keep them punchy, we can take more. Colombia, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, and thank you for very insightful presentations and a very good discussion we've had with everybody. From our perspective, we would join those who have questioned the need or the viability or indeed the usefulness of a standalone goal on transport. But let me explain why, and then let me ask for your inputs as to how we could manage this, because we've been asking for experts in the room to help us figure out these quandaries, and you're the expert, so we have to ask you. You've talked about many different kinds of entry points for tackling these issues about policies, about governance, about technology, about land tenure. So clearly transport in terms of the entry points and how we resolve transport issues are very wide-ranging. You've also talked about issues of balance, which has come up repeatedly between rural and urban. We've talked about territorial approaches, what is a city, what is not a city, big cities, small cities, etc. We've talked a lot about linkages. And I think that particularly in your last two interventions, Professor Rev, you made very interesting linkages to climate change, to health, to the issue of slums, to land use, again to land tenure. Issues of subsidies have come up, issues of biofuels. So clearly, transport is incredibly wide-ranging and cross-cutting, as indeed are very many other issues, food security, water, etc. And that's why I'm interested to sort of plumb your minds to see how we tackle with this, because how we deal with an issue such as transport can be very, very relevant for tackling other multidisciplinary, intersectoral, cross-cutting, issues. So you talked, Dr. Revi, about large, complex, interdependent systems. The other thing that you talked about that I really focused on was that you said that forces at city level, i.e. at local level, could force us to change how we talk about frameworks at national level. So if these two aspects are true, and if this is as multidimensional, the question we would ask is, how could you address this in a goal framework, in the understanding that there probably will not be an SDG on transport. We would not support it for the simple reason that everybody wants something, an SDG on, and we're going to end up with about 327 SDGs at my last count, including things like nuclear waste, breast milk, diarrhea, I've heard as a candidate. The list is endless. In order to deal with that, we've been talking about an integrating approach where you can share targets across goals. If you could subscribe to that view, at least just theoretically in your response, what would be the key targets from a transport perspective, the very, very key targets that you would recommend that we as a group should consider to integrate into that goal framework to tackle some of these very critical key issues in a way that is also relevant for example, greenhouse gas emissions or slums or air quality? What would be those key targets? And the second very specific question is, we've also proposed a dashboard, which is a way of dealing with the differentiation that's necessary in the universal goal. So if you have a target on whatever, could you envisage under that universal target indicators that would be much more specific for different kinds of cities, for different kinds of countries, for different kinds of governance systems, for different kinds of financing? How do we bring the private sector? Could we have an indicator on private-public partnerships to get the kind of investment in infrastructure for transport that we need? So the two questions are very pointed. What would be those key targets? Would a way of achieving differentiation within those targets would be at the indicator level with very specific indicators about different kinds of tackling the different factors of the different contexts and realities. So two very specific questions so that you can guide us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paula. Germany, you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's on? Yeah. First, let me thank the two presenters for their interesting presentations and the very rich discussion we had up to now. I would like to direct two questions to Mr. Revi. Coming from the point that we think that the urban development and the governance on the urban level is absolutely an interesting point for SDGs. I'm very thankful that you put a very good analysis of the urban development problems and also of the governance problems we do have. And also putting your goal, your idea of a standing alone goal into the context of a whole set of goals. I think this is absolutely necessary if we talk about a SDG goal, how it is contexted by the other goals and how that will work. You also did a list of contrafactual arguments which have to be thought of. And one of these contrafactual arguments was that we have too many goals and too many targets. And if you look on your list of 10 SDGs and the SDG goal for itself, you listed 18 targets, three times the 6 targets around the goals. And I think even if you come to smaller cities, you will have more to differentiate targets. So my question would be, if we now come from a set and from an academic discussion to policy to prioritize, do you have any idea which of these goals, these targets within the urban development question could be the one, or could be the 1, 2, or 3 who could be highlighted, because they are very much specific? Because some of your targets, I think, are relatively near to other goals, and we have discussed that already in the last 1 and 2 hours. So that would be my question. If you have any criteria to select, or any idea of a specific smaller set within that which is politically manageable. This is the one question. It's related to my second question, that we have actually an international development on the standard organizations defining sustainable development for cities and finding indicators and targets for that. And they have actually also problems to convince some of the important players on the local level to do such a standardization of sustainable development on the city level, because a lot of local authorities say we can't do that. We don't have the statistics, we don't have the data, we don't have the resources, and we don't want to be compared with other cities which are not comparable with us. This is partially an industry and science-driven initiative, but it's going on, and my question would be, do you know about that, and how could we cooperate and deal with this development if we actually at the same time dealing with an SDG, or possibly dealing with an SDG on urban development? Thank you.
All right, thank you, Germany, for your comments and question.
Those were pretty challenging questions. A few PhDs out there, and if you were politicians and you could answer that question, you would probably go pretty high in becoming sort of ministers or prime ministers of countries. So I'm going to take a very quick stab at that from my own point of view. The first thing is, when we're looking at this framework, it not only has to appeal and be politically palatable and implementable at national level and at regional government level and city level, it has to be comprehensible to citizens. And I would say the real test is, can my 20-year-old daughter or her 8-year-old cousin understand what we're talking about? It has to be simple, straightforward, because what we're trying to do here is mobilize a large number of people. I mean, we're talking about hundreds of millions of people, or even more than that, to make this possible. Getting through the sort of the eye of the needle over the next 20 or 30 years is not an easy thing to do. It's very tough. It's one of the most innovative things that human beings have done for maybe 200 years or so. So taking that into account, let me sort of throw out some numbers. The first thing is, I don't think you can have more than 7, 8, 10 goals. It's just not comprehensible to people. It becomes complicated and very difficult to deal with. They have to be simply articulated. And of course, there you have a question of trade-offs and choices. So if you have, let's say, a maximum of 10 goals, I put up 10, it could be less, you immediately come to a situation where to operationalize those goals that people can understand and relate to, you have to have a minimal set of targets. So that's the reason why I picked 3. That's the reason why STSN and many of us have picked 3, because below 3 you come into a very linear engagement. You don't understand the complexities. You can't sort of capture the complexities of dealing with a complex system. So that's 10 to 3, that's 30. And then of course the big challenge is, beyond 100, we can't count on our fingers and toes. So actually, you should only have sort of 3 sets of indicators. But there's a problem there. The problem is that you need to be able to accommodate both things that happen at national level, because that's what we're all about here, and that's how the negotiations happen, that's how the money flows, but also something that happens at local level. And I think that's a very interesting struggle. The struggle between universal indicators that can be used for comparison to detail how resources can flow, how access can be provided, how governance can be organized, and things that you need to be able to operationalize challenges at city level. So that's the reason, notionally, you could use 5, but I chose 6. Which is an issue. It's a real issue there. So embedded in that is the idea that you have 2 levels of sort of indicators to come into that process, but straight away you have a problem. You have 30 targets, and if you have 6 indicators, you get to 200. And that's sort of a little bit beyond what people can handle in their head, and even bureaucracies can handle, and how deals can be made within, let's say, political systems. So there's a tricky issue that's to be dealt there. So maybe you can partition the set into 2. I don't know. I mean, this is something that really needs to be debated and thought out. And of course, the simple way of dealing with it, if you think systemically, is that you try and bring convergence between multiple goals. And I think for that, the idea that you have a whole framework and you're able to look at trade-offs and convergences is going to be an interesting one. So to my mind, there needs to be analytical work done on this. That's one part of the story. There has to be practical work done at the local and regional government level to see what actually works on the ground. Because at the end of the day, this is about getting something to happen. You can get a PhD in this business, but it doesn't help you very much. You really have to make a change on the ground. So for that, we have to experiment. We have to build a framework in which there is a dialectic, there's a dialogue between these multiple levels to make that happen. And if we do that, then hopefully we can actually enable that convergence. So if you take a territorial approach, I can see, for example, the wonderful thing that we've heard from the transportation people actually spanning those 2 systems, because rural systems and international transportation are very different from what happens inside cities. But if you're able to pull that together, you can actually bring this down to a parsimonious set, which can then be simple and sort of operationalizable. But it's not easy, because this is the reason that we're challenged. This is all of humanity trying to, at very different levels of development, trying to come to a consensus that can work for all of us and can be implemented in practice. So this is a hard task, and I do not envy yourselves and certainly the co-chairs to try and lead this process to some kind of a practical conclusion. If this works for us, it will be interesting to actually bring in, for better or for worse, the private sector into the discussion. Because for better or for worse, as far as cities are concerned, the private sector is a very important set of players. And the private sector actually is not only large transnational, it all goes all the way down to informal enterprises of the poor and collectors of the poor. So I think an engagement around that and sort of opening up perspectives from the view of people's movements, of community groups, all the way up to large transnationals is an interesting question to deal with. The challenge, of course, is you want to align people to these larger goals, but not suggest what they want to do. So just like, people can pick up things voluntarily and run with it, you want an alignment. And I think at the level of the goal, if you get the alignment, then the indicator systems will actually work themselves out. But this is an interesting question. You'll have to talk to central banks about this question. You'll have to talk to financial regulators about this question. You'll have to also talk to people who deal with fiscal federal relations to make sure that where the money flows and where the power is gets sort of sorted out as far as that's concerned. So the operational challenge, I think, that national governments and local and regional governments will have is to set up the systems to actually track and manage this process without being overburdened. And, it's expensive. It involves people. It involves complexity. It involves whole new sort of forms of bureaucracy that you may or may not be able to afford or create. So I think being parsimonious there would be really very good for us to make this happen. So things that are cross-cutting, and that's why within the STSN, I and my co-chairs have been very actively involved in discussions with the health people. So how do you deal with sort of urban health questions within something else, link it into questions of water? You don't have to have everything under one goal. You can't solve everything around one process. The framework has to deliver. And I think that's the interesting opportunity for us. And where, let's say, the urban opportunity essentially lies on 2 or 3 things. It arises around where the money is. That's where the money, unfortunately, in many parts of the world is being created. Where the externalities come from, also from cities, so you've got to fix both of them simultaneously, and where the power resides. But finally, at the end of the day, I'll close with saying, it is the excitation of the imagination of the ordinary citizen, the young person, that will make this stuff actually work in practice. So we need to do something that's simple, straightforward, can be implemented, and can connect the dots to make it happen.
I think you'll all agree that's a very good note on which to end this particular conversation. And you've hit on some truly important points, the both of you have, that are going to challenge this group, not just on issues of urbanization, but across the board on all the issues that we've been trying to deal with. And urbanization is one of 39 issues that we have been trying to grapple with. So you can imagine how complex and challenging this is. The solution, of course, will not come from the co-chairs. The solution will come from the membership. That's one way of getting under from that particular challenge. Having said that, I think some of the ideas that have been expressed here today begin to send the kind of signal that we all need to begin to use in analyzing and in thinking through the issues that we are trying to deal with moving forward. So thank you, the both of you, very much. It's been a wonderfully interactive and very interesting debate. Thank you, Dr. Claus, for remaining in the room 2 days in a row. I appreciate that. And thank all of you for the comments that you've brought to the table, because they have been very, very useful.